Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Hocus Pocus number 15. I'm your co-host, Thomas Sheridan, and I'm with
Sara Mondaini
over in England. And we're at number 15 now, which is remarkable. Sarah, we're flying through them. We'll be 20 before we know it. And we're going to have a jam-packed show tonight, as usual, and all the usual goodies. And thanks for your support and everything so far. The last show was great support on that as usual, and great feedback. How are you, Sarah?
Yes, I'm not so bad. I was enjoying the nicer weather, but it lasted about 10 minutes and then it went away. But I managed to get some of the garden tidied up, which has been a job that needed doing. Been a long time coming. But apart from that, just been plodding along, working hard and working on some new projects.
Yeah.
And preparing for our show.
Yep, and the interesting thing is, do you remember last week's psychic weather about the water and that all stopped now? All the leaks have all stopped. It's the weirdest thing, and even the mysterious ones, the strangest ones of all, didn't happen. They're gone. These stopped yesterday. Even though I thought it was a leak in the roof, it was lashing rain the last 2 days. Didn't come through. So it was just a weird kind of leaking issue that we had that was just affecting us, and washing machine was acting funny. And now it's just suddenly fine. So there was definitely something weird and all that. But we seem to be, hopefully this winter will be over soon. This winter that seems to be lasting 100 years. But either way, the world is full of 40 and stuff. And that's our job to bring it to you. Now, tonight's first story is about the Arthurian legends and the Grail mysteries, and where do they come from, and what do they really mean? Now, you will see traditionally from like the kind of Hollywood point of view, Camelot and so on, that the Arthurian legends are very much associated with like a kind of an English thing, but they're really not. They're actually a Welsh thing. It's really a symbolic Welsh mythos that goes back into the ancient parts of Celtic mythology, really. Now, what we know as the Grail mysteries now, the Arthurian stories, are really romances that were developed in France at the very end of the cycle of these mythologies beginning. So we're talking about the High Middle Ages. That was almost like an amalgamation of all the previous versions of the Arthurian legends, going right back to the story of Pendragon. And it was, you can imagine like if we had all the Star Wars films were suddenly made into one film, like say the first three, the classics, the trilogy, and they were made into one film by a certain date, and everyone thought that was ground zero. It's not. It was a body of work that was collected over time and amalgamated into these really popular French language stories that were written in the High Middle Ages, and very, very popular as more and more people became literate. There were sensations. They were like epics. And people think that characters like Lancelot were always involved in these stories. So, he came in the last incarnation of it. So did the Holy Grail and things like the Fisher King and these other strange characters that are associated with the Grail mysteries, Parsifal. They became more fleshed out and more in-depth. Now, the origins of the Arthurian legends go right back into Celtic prehistory. You're talking about a time when the Roman Empire was in decline in Britain, And following this, you have the Saxon, the Germanic invasions, the tribes coming in from Germany, Frisians, Angles, and so on, coming into England, the eastern part of England, and pushing what were the Celtic people of Britain to the west. And they were known at this time as Brittonic. This would be the term you'd give for them, but they're really Welsh. They were actually Welsh. Wales was a much larger country back then that extended from Cornwall all the way up to the Scottish borders. And what we think of Wales today is only basically an enclave of what was left over. So these were Celtic stories that are very similar to some of the Irish stories and have very similar motifs and symbolisms, such as the Grail treasures are very similar, they're identical almost to the 4 treasures of the Tuatha Dé Danann. That gives you a hint now of where this is really coming from. The stories go back to the ancient Brittonic kings of Wales. A lot of these would have been heroic lord type stories. Brittonic Odins, this is what an Arthur would have been. And these stories revolve around not only disputes with the Germanic invaders in the east, but also dealing with the remnants of the Roman Empire, dealing with there was a story of invasions between the Brittonics and Ireland. So there was constant invasions back and forth. So a lot of the stories that are in the Arthurian legends have their roots in heroic tales of Brittonic Welsh knights going to Ireland and involving themselves in battles, stealing a magical cauldron and so on from giants. And then back and forth, and the Irish would invade Wales, Cornwall, and the north of England, northwest of England, and the cycle continued. So a lot of the myth origins that lead to the Arthurian legends are not really about dealing with the Germanic tribes. They're much more dealing with the Irish and the Scottish. Well, they would have been the remnants of the Picts at that time. This became a solidifying statement or mythology for the Arthurian legends that we know today of Arthur and Guinevere, Lancelot, and so on. And then I said they developed from the original Geoffrey of Monmouth compilation of these stories, who wrote them in a kind of a very English way. Even though it was Welsh, there was something English about it. There was an English aesthetic about the stories. Now, we can't almost certainly, just like many people have speculated about Odin, we can actually say that the heroic lord of the character of Arthur was probably based on a real chieftain, a real Brittonic or Welsh chieftain. And it became sanctified through the stories and telling, to the point where later on, by the time the French started writing these stories down, the pagan narrative became a Christian narrative. So the cauldron that they stole from Ireland became the Holy Grail, the cup of Jesus, and this kind of thing. And dichotomies and issues that you had in the biblical stories were dovetailed into the Arthurian legend. So there's not a million miles between Mary Magdalene in the kind of esoteric sense and Guinevere. You have this kind of element of saturation of the new order being put into these stories. But they're fantastic stories, and that's why they last. Now, we can say for a fact that Merlin was a real character. He was a guy called Mithrin, and he was at a battle, and he saw actually Merlin translated into English, Old English actually means excrement. So that was the weird one. That was the French version of his name. In English, it didn't translate very well. But Mithrin was a Brittonic Welsh aristocrat, nobleman, and he was probably the oldest case in history, or the first recorded case in history, of post-traumatic stress for a person involved in the military. He witnessed lots of his friends and his family members killed at this brutal battle, and he went psychotic and ended up in the woods on the Scottish borders, which was still part of Wales at that time. And that just shows you how big Wales used to be. And up there, he basically became a druid again. He lived among the wild. And this is why they called him the son of a devil. He was the son of paganism. And he came out and gave, in the time of Christianity, the old bardic druid wisdom to the Brythonic tribes, who then were converting slowly towards Christianity. So when you read, and there's numerous versions, I was looking through them the other few days there's a lot of different versions of the Grail mysteries. And that's because, to a certain extent, it's an ongoing living myth. And there's all kinds of authors who try to, find the authentic lineage back to Pendragon, his father, and so on, and all the other things. But there's been very good other alternative theories that perhaps Lancelot was an Irish knight that had formed an alliance with a Welsh king and then betrayed him. And then at the end, you all know the story that Arthur goes to the island of Apples, Avalon, which is, most people would tell you, is Glastonbury. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, because that part of Glastonbury, Somerset, in England at that time, was not only, right in the part of the world where it should be for these Brythonic mythologies to have taken place, but these were all islands. They were all flooded. Those areas were flooded. And the places we know, like Glastonbury today and the Tor, they would have been islands. Now, there's a lot of contention if that really is him buried in the abbey with Guinevere. And that could be a relic from the Middle Ages to drum up money. It's a hard one to speculate or tell. But there's absolutely no doubt that an Arthur character in some form lived as a heroic lord. And when you read these modern, when I say modern, I mean like the French versions from the High Middle Ages, you're dealing with a Celtic heroic myth that goes back into the absolute ancient recesses of antiquity. And I think this is why it's always appealed to people. It's because it taps into something very, very deep, and it can also be changed to accommodate different things. In World War II, the image of Arthur was put on posters standing on the White Cliffs of Dover, fighting back the Luftwaffe. It goes to show you how powerful the archetype has become. And I think will always remain that way. So the Welsh gave us that gift. They gave us the gift of the Arthurian legends. And its legacy continues to this day. And there's also, we have the supernaturalism of it. We have the legends such as Stonehenge was brought from Uisneach in Ireland by Merlin. He levitated the stones and brought them over. And that was always seen as a preposterous thing. But now we found out that where the Purelli Mountains are in Wales, where the Stonehenge blue stones came from, at the time of Merlin Mithrin, was actually part of Ireland, was under Irish control. That's why it's full of high crosses and Olm stones and so on. So there you go. The Arthurian legends, probably Wales's greatest cultural gift to the world, and they don't get enough credit for it. Everyone thinks it's English. What do you think of that, Sarah?
I found an interesting snippet while I was doing some research for the show about this, and the historian Alan Wilson believes that two Arthurs actually existed. There were two King Arthurs. There was one in 383 to 388 who fought the Romans, and there was another Arthur in 600 who fought the Saxons. And Arthur II is documented as being the king of Glamorgan, and he's a sixth generation descendant from the first Arthur in 383. And this Alan Wilson believes that the church tried to cancel this from the British history for religious and political correctness, and he reckons they would have got away with it too if it hadn't been for the Arthurian legends.
Fascinating. I saw his stuff about 10 years ago when it was quite popular. I did find his timelines confusing. He was but then again, we know that the timelines are all over the place with regard to the Middle Ages anyway. But yeah, so his theory, I like that a lot. One a Roman, one that fought the Romans, and one that fought the Saxons. And that would explain the overlapping kind of Roman Germanic story, even though the Romans and the Germans, the Germanic invasion of England was hundreds of years apart. but that would solidify it. So that's quite a plausible theory, I think.
Yeah, he mentions the Brecon manuscripts have the list of the parentage of these two Arthurs, and they are direct descendants. So yeah, it is interesting.
And then you fuse in Celtic myths into that, and you have like the sword and the stone, which is very similar. You know, the sword being extracted from the stone gives the true king of the Britons. Well, that's exactly the same as the Leofal at the Hill of Tara, that it will the man who puts his hand on it who will announce as the true king of Ireland. So that goes back to the same Celtic, Gaelic, whatever you want to call it, proto myth. Absolutely. And then you have the cauldron of the Dagda in the Irish myths, and then you have the Holy Grail, and you have the Spear of Destiny, which was brought into the Grail mysteries and made its way into the Germanic mysteries. You have the Spirit of Lu in the Irish Celtic thing. So it definitely, there's a point zero in all this Celtic mythology that goes back far off in time, but it was absorbed and added, and just like it was done with, you know, Lancelot's edition in the High Middle Ages by the French, it's stuck in different levels. So you take something that was real and you mythologize it by gluing a very early mythology upon it.
Well, the legend said, didn't it, that when he pulled the sword from the stone, that was the prophecy coming true, that the one true king would take over the country and bring it back into righteousness again. And then in 1485, Henry Tudor claimed the crown of England, and the people of Wales thought that that prophecy had actually come true because Merlin had prophesied there'd be a battle between two dragons. The prophecy had come true there. So that was interesting.
Yeah, it's also interesting how the size of Wales has been kind of radically reduced. You know, when you see those old maps from that period, it was absolutely gigantic. It's stretched all the way from Cornwall to Scotland, and now it's just a tiny, you know, sort of like a large peninsula sticking out the side of England, and it just goes to show you how much is hidden. You would tell to the average person, they wouldn't believe it. They wouldn't know that. I would say Wales once went up as far as like Cumbria and over towards near Newcastle. Yeah, it did. And that's where Merlin was. Now, you'd think the Merlin story, even though we know he was a true person and a true character, it was almost like an attempt to justify the bards. You know, the bards still existed in feudal society at that period, and it was almost like that was like a tip of the hat to the bardic tradition.
It would be nice to think that there was two King Arthurs. I like the idea that he existed. He was based on a real man,
Yeah,
or two real men, rather than just being a myth and a legend.
yes. And then so many Christians only think it's a Christian story. They just think it's a Christian story for the, you know, the sort of like the Christianization of England. And the French story, ironically, is very much in that regard. That God.
Well, that's like you say, they changed the paraphernalia, didn't they? The cauldron to the Holy Grail and the Spear of Destiny.
Yeah, and see, that's why the whole thing with the Holy Blood, Holy Grail element of that kind of big thing of the Da Vinci Code and all that, ultimately that's based on a fiction that this Holy Grail exists in Europe somewhere, but it was only a change. You know, people are obsessed with this concept of the Holy Grail, the actual cup that took the blood of Christ being somewhere in Europe. But all the French authors did was just change the cauldron to that. So it's a totally fictional thing. It has no basis in reality beyond this, you know, a change in a story. And look what that generated. You know, the sangreal, the royal blood, the bloodlines of the Merovingians. It just never ends. I mean, to this day, we're still living with the legacy of Arthurian and the legends and the Grail mysteries, Grail romances, as they call. Well, this week's folk horror cinema film is the 1976 Brian De Palma film version of the Stephen King book Carrie. Now, this film, I watched it again the other night and hadn't seen it for a while. And my God, it's an emotional roller coaster. You really feel the sadness of this girl's existence. Carrie, who lives in an American small town, and Stephen King, who wrote the story while I believe he was still in college. He was very lucky. He became a success from a very early age, literally, for a writer. And it initially deals with the dark underbelly of the American dream. This school, this perfect American high school, where the girls are all pretty and everything. But it's not. There's a tremendous jealousies, class system, bullying, vicious bullying. And the film begins with this young girl called Carrie, who's played by Sissy Spacek, beautifully, I might add. And she has a mother who's a religious nutcase, who has not raised her properly and didn't even tell her that she was to expect her menstrual cycle. And one day after a terrible volleyball practice, she's in the showers at work and she starts to menstruate and doesn't know what's happening. And then the other girls all laugh at her. Now, it shows a kind of a transformative thing where some people, at least two of the students, realized that was evil what they did, but the other ones didn't. They were remorseless. And because they decide that Carrie is a problem because them bullying her was the reason why they had to do this attention. If they didn't do the attention, they wouldn't do prom night at the school. Now, one of the girls, who's like the most popular girl in school, tells the teacher to go get stuffed, and she's banned from prom night, but she doesn't blame herself. Her and her psychopathic boyfriend blame Carrie and decide that they're going to get revenge on her somehow. Now, this is where something terrible happens, where good intentions and wicked intentions kind of fuse together. Carrie, there's another girl in the school who realizes that she was horrible, what she did to that kid. And her and her boyfriend decide, like, why don't you take her to the prom? And just to kind of give her a life after the horrible experiences she went through in school. Now, the school teacher is happy but cynical about this as well. That's a practical joke that they're playing on this poor girl. And the female school teacher the gym teacher develops a kind of a matronly bond with her. At the same motherly bond, at the same time, her own mother is a lunatic. When she finds out she bled, she quotes all this biblical scripture about women being unclean and locks her in a closet while the poor girl is claustrophobic. And there's this illuminated statue of Saint Sebastian with all the arrows in him in the closet with her. And you spend a huge amount of the film, Carrie, heartbroken. It's actually tugs at your heartstrings, because the real horror in Carrie is humans. They're the monsters. Now, she develops telekinesis, she finds out, as a means to protect herself. And she's able to use that first to dominate her mother and say, I'm going to that prom. And also she use it to, and mother thinks she's a witch then. Now, this telekinesis, the combination of this and the good-looking boy in school, well, he's supposed to be good-looking, who brings her to the prom, increases her self-esteem. But at the same time, the girl that was expelled from the prom, John Travolta's girlfriend, kill a pig, drain its blood, and put it in a bucket above the stage with the plan of fixing the king and queen of the prom vote. So she's on the stage and they pull the cord and the bucket of blood falls down on Carrie and they all laugh at her. Now, the build up to the scene is just like, you know what's coming, but you feel awful because it's just like, here's a girl for the first time in her life has genuine happiness. Here's two students who genuinely have come around and do care about her and do want to make her happy. And then there's other people too, not just a school teacher. There's what you realize, it's a classic story of someone who's bullied in a job they think everyone is against him. But the silent majority is actually not against him. They're probably in favor of them, but they don't know what to do about it because of the prevailing social class. The worst happens, the bucket of blood falls, is pulled down, and then she uses her telekinesis to kill the guilty and the innocent in the school prom with electrocutions and fires and crushings and everything. And it showed that even when it happened, there was only one or two thought it was a joke. The rest was looking at it saying, oh, this is awful, which showed that it only takes one or two bullies in a social circle or a culture, in a workplace or in a school to create this monstrous life for someone. Anyway, Carrie comes home, her mother stabs her, and then she basically kills her mother. The house collapses in a kind of a catalytic exteriorization, telekinesis implosion, and it ends up with the girl who was trying to help her having a nightmare of her coming from the grave. Now, Carrie is a film that really is not about, although it has telekinesis, and though it has catalytic exteriorization phenomenon, it's really about the wickedness of the dark side of the American dream and American high schools and bullying in general and religious fanaticism. And it's not an easy watch. It's still superb after all these years. Stephen King knows how to tell a great story. And you want to root for at the end, but she ends up killing good people as well too. So you're sort of like, oh my God, this is a psychic explosion that's gone out of kilter. But it also teaches you kind of that if you do have a magical gift, you can't use it while you're in an irrational state because you'll damage innocent people too. But that was Carrie, and an excruciatingly sad movie as much as a scary one. How did you feel about it, Sarah?
Pretty much the same as you. It wasn't so much a vengeance film, but a film about what can happen when you're pushed to the limits by other people from all angles. She was a regular teen going through stuff that all teenage girls go through, but she had no support from her mother except to be told that everything was a sin. She was surrounded by narcissists, bullies, psychopaths, and she had no idea how to deal with any of it except to go inside herself in an attempt to be invisible and have a bit of a peaceful life at school. And when she discovered her telekinesis wasn't an evil power and that other people actually had it too, she started to read about it in the library and learn about what it meant. That's when she realized, that was the moment she realized that she wasn't odd. It was everyone else around her that was the problem. And she was just a nice kid who was lonely, needed a friend, someone to confide in. And the gym teacher tried to be that confidant to her. And one of the other girls, Sue Snell, tried to help by asking a boyfriend to escort Carrie to the prom in an attempt to help her be more accepted and less socially awkward. And while it was a nice idea to try and make things right, it was doomed to fail. And because the PE teacher, the gym teacher, didn't trust these girls, when Sue did turn up at the prom and she saw what was about to happen with the bucket and she tried to stop it, the gym teacher got the wrong end of the stick, and that's what caused the whole thing to go off. And I think if Sue had been more of a friend to Carrie, instead of trying to fix things without her peers knowing, the fear of what they might think, Carrie might have had a better time at school. And I also think it went beyond bullying and teenage angst. The ringleader, Chris, and her boyfriend, they went so deep into the depravity with what they did that it went into full-blown psychopathy, and it wasn't a teenage stage that they were going through with racing hormones. They were actually deranged. And then you see Carrie.
Yeah, wasn't John Travolta fantastic as like the vicious thug? I thought he was amazing.
It was a great acting, but that character got on my nerves.
Well, you do meet those types, these oafish, violent, like the way he's punching. Don't call me that, he'd punch her.
Yeah.
And that whole thing, yes. Women being attracted to the biggest losers, and he was the biggest loser going.
And you had Carrie there enjoying the prom, and you did actually forget for a moment it was a horror film, because you found yourself sat there watching her and you were smiling with her and feeling really good for her. You know, she'd made it. She was past the social awkwardness and she was finally being seen for the very first time as a regular girl. And it almost has this Cinderella feel to it.
Yes.
And then that in contrast to what happens next when she becomes humiliated, and you've got her face there covered in blood and her eyes and that rage coming off her. And even as iconic as that scene is, you can't help but feel that they all got what was coming to them. And the rage that washed over her was like this righteous anger that had been a long time coming, even though there was a lot of collateral damage there as well. And it was a reminder that we shouldn't have to try so hard to fit in. And what other people think of us isn't that important in the grand scheme of things. And all of Carrie's social issues actually stemmed from home with the dogmatic mother. And it was a fantastic climax. And just when you think the night can't get any worse, you're wrong, because it goes much worse. And I thought the ending was really sad, that even her mother was so brainwashed that she went beyond unstable and she put Jesus before everything, including her own daughter. And she ended up looking more like that statue that she punished Carrie with than she bargained for at the end. And there was only one way that movie could end, and I won't spoil it. And it had gone past the point of no return. There's no coming back from the events and the betrayals of that night. And the only decent one out of all of them with a pure heart really was Carrie.
That scene when the mother is impaled with the knives and forks, where she symbolizes saints, the same saints as Saint Sebastian's statue in the closet, that was one of the standout scenes. It had a lot of visual scenes that stood out. Brian De Palma used some of Alfred Hitchcock's green screen type effects. Do you remember the scene at the beginning where Tommy is reading the poem that really impresses the English teacher, and he's in the foreground and she's in the back? The sort of like both foreground and far away is in focus, and she goes, "It's beautiful." You notice the side of his hair is all feathered like ours are here because of the green screen. And that was a standout scene. There was loads of those kinds of, like you said a few weeks ago, when you watch a film, you learn about making films from watching a film. And that was one of those films as well that had that thing. There was, at the end of they have the split screens like the movie Woodstock, where they show one side of the chaos in the room and then horror. And they even use the Alfred Hitchcock, they'll all laugh at you. They'll all laugh at you. The end scene is unbelievably intense. But yeah, it's a great film. Even with all the sadness, even with all the nastiness, that scene where the girl, I forget her name, who sees the rope behind the stage, and the way she follows the rope up to the bucket and then follows it back down to John Travolta and the other girl on beneath, that was a fantastic scene how that was done. The way she notices the rope at first but doesn't see the significance of it, and then it gets slapped again, and then she starts following the rope. And like I said, she actually was trying to help, but the school teacher was going, "This little evil bitch," and she wasn't. The little evil one was under the stage. But
yeah, well, they got what was coming to them as well, didn't they? Because they got out of the building into the car, and they had it away down the road.
She tried to murder Carrie.
Yes.
And then she used the telekinesis to flip the car over. But then it was all innocent people like the gym teacher, like Tommy. Well, Tommy wasn't killed by Carrie. The bucket fell on his head. And they were even laughing at that. Even his friends were laughing at that. But very 70s too. Lots of very 70s looks and fashions. That guy who played Tommy, he was in a TV show in the early 80s, I remember, called The Last American Hero. And it was a big hit with my little brothers used to love that back then. It's like a kids kind of adventure show. And he didn't really do much else after that. But he was supposed to be really good looking. I thought he was really goofy looking. He was like a failed Robert Plant, but he was quite good. He was quite a good actor. But his image was, yeah, a great film. I really think it's great. I have no problems with it at all. It's not family viewing, of course, but if you want a really good Stephen King American horror film from the 70s, you can't go wrong with it. It's got everything, and it really does exactly what it says on the tin.
What made me laugh was these characters were supposed to be about 16, 17 years old. And I think the actors playing them were about 25,
At
which
least,
didn't kind of fit.
yeah. And but they had like younger looking actors in there, and but I remember when I was in school, I can remember like when I was in first year of what we, secondary school, as we call in this part of the world, the girls and the guys that were doing their final year in school, they were like grown men and women to me. Even though they're only 4 years away. It's funny how that is that when you're at that age. That's what I was looking at that yesterday and thinking about. That was kind of funny. But yeah, it's a great film, and definitely was does it launch Stephen King on his career. It definitely gave him, both films and his books. I've never read the book, to be honest with you. I'd like to see how different it is. Did you notice when she was looking through the bookshop as well? One of the books was the Tarot book by Alfred Douglas, which is the book that I always recommend to people when they want to learn tarot. There's a hardback version of that, so that's one of those little kind of trivia things you notice. But yeah, Carrie, watch it, and don't, if you're feeling really emotional, don't watch it because I was on the point of tears at certain parts as well. It does really tugs on your heartstrings, and but it's at the end you want to shout yeah when she's getting them all, but you don't really, because it's just like friendly fire killings, people that did nothing and no harm to her and only wanted to do good for her all dying. But yeah, that was also teach you, if you have these powers like telekinesis, use them wisely. Another message of Carrie. And for next week's folk horror cinema, we picked on the 1962 film Carnival of Souls, a film that has no one famous in it, not directed by anyone particular famous, but it's the David Lynch horror film that was made probably before David Lynch even made a film, long before he ever made Eraserhead. It's a very interesting film set in Middle America, and I'm a big fan of it. And that's it, Carnival of Souls, a 1962 one, and it's in the public domain, this film, so it's very easy to find. It should be on YouTube, so you should have no problem getting it. Carnival of Souls.
Our second topic tonight is about Jack the Ripper. And Jack the Ripper was the name given to the infamous serial killer who during August and November of 1888 murdered 5 women in the East End of London, in particular the Whitechapel area. The murders were very gruesome, and the victims were disemboweled, disfigured, and they had their throats slit. The throats were cut prior to the mutilations, which were performed afterwards, with the removal of internal organs from at least 3 of the victims, and it led police to believe that the killer had some kind of surgical or anatomical knowledge. There was fear and panic across the city, and the murderer was unknown, although some witnesses had said that women were seen with a well-dressed gentleman prior to their death, but it was never specified if it was the same gentleman or different ones. There were 5 murders that were known as the Canonical 5, which were believed to be committed by the same hand between the 31st of August and the 9th of November, 1888. But there were investigations into 11 gruesome and brutal murders in the same area between 1888 and 1891. Not all of these could be confirmed as being committed by the same hand, though. The women were not only brutally murdered, but also in death, they were also humiliated too, because when the photographs of the bodies were taken, the large box cameras that were too bulky to get down low enough to capture the image, so that they had to get creative. So the bodies were actually holstered up onto a meat hook on the wall so that the pictures could be taken. There was a pattern to the killings. They seemed to take place around weekends and public holidays, and they were all within a short distance of each other. So some people believe the Ripper was in regular employment and he lived locally. whereas other theorists say the killer was an educated upper-class man, possibly a doctor or an aristocrat who ventured into the Whitechapel from a higher-class area. None of the murders were solved, and they became a combination of historical research and folklore, which has captured the public imagination. It's assumed that the crimes ended because of either the culprit's death or imprisonment or possible emigration. There were over 100 suspects as to who the Ripper was. Some of the more famous ones were Prince Albert Victor, the artist Walter Sickert, and the author Lewis Carroll, but more on those later on. Other theorists believe Jack was actually more than one killer and that each murder was committed by unconnected individuals acting independently of each other, and others cite it was part of a group carrying out the murders to silence a scandal. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle even had a theory about it being a female murderer dubbed Jill the Ripper, and supporters of this theory believe the murderer worked as a midwife who could be seen with bloody clothes without attracting suspicion and would be much more easily trusted by the victims than a man. Another woman suggested as the Ripper was the theosophist Helena Blavatsky. It's a very dark subject, and I think it's because the murders have never been solved, and that gives it kind of an element of supernatural about it. Was there more to Jack than him being a human being? Was he a phantom, a demon? What was it that attracted him to the Whitehall area? Was he a phantom who stalked the night? Was it Freemasons to do with the royal family trying to silence a scandal? There are so many suspects, so many theories, and so many questions. It's impossible to make any sense of. What are your thoughts on it?
There's a prevailing supernaturalism about this whole story. Yes, it's a serial killer story. Yes, it's a horrific thing. Mainly prostitutes, people on the margins of society being murdered. But even with all that, and I know a lot of it probably it's because of the ambiance, the aesthetic, this Gothic London lit by gaslight, quiet, narrow streets in Whitechapel. Well, one of them happened in the city of London, I know that. This darkened corners. Yes, it has all that sort of Gothic Victorian melodrama thing going on. But beyond that, there's the killings themselves are just unfathomable. The disembowelings and the removal of sexual organs and so on. The person who was working for Mary Kelly's landlord, when he found her body in the flat, in the room, while he was collecting the rent, said that the assault was not human. It was like a demon, and he was like a demon attacked her. And I just find it amazing that in one of the most heavily populated areas in the world, and densely populated streets, cities, areas in the world, that nothing was seen. There were men seen with some of them, but they could have been just any man. There's no proof. It was the Ripper. The fact that he got away with the murders, with the amount of police that were on the beat, it's unfathomable. It's almost supernatural in itself how he got away with it. Now, there was always criticisms of the London police. They were Keystone cops and they made a mess of it. That's not true at all. Considering the technology they had and what they were trying to do and never had faced anything like this before, they actually did the best job they could. This guy, or whatever it was, that outwitted them, was in a league all by himself. Just the fact that he was able to escape, and in all the murders, there was literally the escape streets had a policeman on it, and yet he got away. This I find phenomenal. There was other social issues involved, that they were afraid that there'd be trouble with Jewish immigrants. They're getting blamed for it, and it might be an outbreak of anti-Semitism. One of the suspects was an individual called Leather Apron, who was a Polish Jew who wore a leather apron, and he had been arguing with prostitutes and stuff like that, but he had a cast iron alibi for every killing. So it wasn't him. There was always a thought that the person was a surgeon. But then other people pointed out that that part of London was where all the butchers were, and all the slaughterhouses were. So, lots of people who lived there knew how to kill animals and dismember them and all this kind of thing. You just cannot. I just can't personally get away from the supernaturalism. Why is this story prevail? Why does it still go on? Why is it, like you said, told about Freemasons and all these? So there's numerous suspects. There's like on top of the ones you mentioned. I never heard about Blavatsky, but there's numerous suspects that that are all plausible, including one individual died in a mental hospital that was basically ties up with it. But there was other ones too. Like one guy went to America, and he was a suspect in serial killings over in New York. I think it was. He was an Irish guy, I think, or an Irish American. And so on and so forth. More than who done it, for me, will always be, how the hell did he get away? How the hell did he elude the police? By the time Mary Kelly was killed, and the final victim, which was some of the most vicious and ferocious, that you literally could not turn in the East End of London 24 hours a day without a copper being there. And yet he still got away. And that's why you get the whole thing of, was it someone in high society who was connected? I don't know. Like I've gone through all those things. He's so elusive, or she's so elusive, or it's so elusive. And I think that's that carries the myth. This kind of concept is it still out there? I think that's because it was never caught. Because that creates a kind of a supernatural mythology of its own. Like Jack is still out there waiting for you. I'm sure parents used to scare their kids, go to bed or Jack the Ripper will get you for decades after in that part of London. And it's amazing how popular that story and continues to amaze and fascinate people all over the world to this day. And when there's been murders like it all the time all over the world. But I think it's because it's a Victorian melodrama with Gothic overtones, and also the fact that the aesthetic of it, where it took place, when it took place, creates a supernaturalism about it.
Yes, yeah, you're right. Is it still out there? I mean, why did it just stop? There was 8,500 people apparently living within the 233 common lodgings in that area, and that's where a lot of the murders took place, within the streets of those lodges. So did he just poof? Did he just disappear into thin air?
The pubs were open 24 hours a day, and there was hundreds of them. And so there was, and like I said, the police were on the streets 24 hours a day. And nobody saw nothing. They just found dead bodies. And the fact that, like, there was also a belief still prevailed then that the last thing a person saw in their eyes was the murderer. So the police used to look into the eyes to see if they could see the murderer. That belief still existed even then in 1888. It's the fact that the thing is not who he was for me. The thing is how the hell he got away. It'll always be that.
It does sound it could be one of two things. One could be the phantom / demon type entity, and the other, because he'd just disappear. And the other thing could be somebody very high class in royalty, or very high up in the police, even within the Freemasons. So he's covered.
It had a lot of social implications. Like people were shocked by the poverty of how people lived in the East End. That had never been reported, just how horrible the lodging houses were, with people sleeping hanging over a rope. In some cases, the cheapest lodging of all to get hung over, and whole families used to sleep like hanging over a rope. And the 1 penny a night lodging money, and the absolute poverty and the alcoholism. George Bernard Shaw even said the greatest gift that the Ripper gave us was that he actually educated the comfortable people about how bad it was for the poor in the East End. And the other social thing about it, I forgot what I was going to say. The other social thing about it was the relationship with the police. The police were never questioned before that, especially the police commissioners, the heads of the police. And this was the first time that the newspapers and the politicians openly mocked the police investigation, calling the commissioner idiots, calling the police idiots, which they weren't when you look into it. They absolutely weren't. So there was before that, the police were considered sacrosanct. Police investigations were, many of the men who led the police force were former military men, held in the highest esteem. And now suddenly they were being called idiots by the newspapers, and they just weren't used to that. They were not used to being spoken to like that.
My attention was drawn to Patricia Cronwell and her book, Portrait of a Killer, which was all about Jack the Ripper, and she got some forensic evidence and brought it into the art world with Walter Sickert, who was the post-impressionist English painter. And apparently he was quite into the cases of Jack the Ripper, to the point of being obsessed with them. And he was known to boast about renting a studio that was once occupied by Jack the Ripper. And he painted a series of paintings. One was called The Camden Town Murder, and the other one was Jack the Ripper's Bedroom, I think it was called, and it was looking through the painting of a shadowy man looking through the window. So he was one of the big suspects. There was over 100, but he was like top of the list. And they say that if he wasn't the Ripper, some of the Ripperologists say that if he wasn't the Ripper, then he was at the very least an accomplice, or he knew something about it.
I was collaborating with a filmmaker on a Jack the Ripper film at one time, in an actual, drama. And he actually consulted me about, like, if I was, because he'd read my book on psychopaths, and I was like, said to him, I would tell as a supernatural-esque story. And I had like played on these Jungian motifs that there would have been the strange disturbances in the River Thames of things moving under the water that no one could explain right before the murders began, almost like the subconscious of the city coming up through the dark, silted river. And he loved the idea. It was never made a film, but he loved the idea. But I often wondered if you were there in that part of the world before the murders began, would you have noticed these auguries, like strange disturbances in the water, crows all over the place, this kind of thing, because these things don't happen without auguries before them. I think it's one of those, if I was ever to tackle the Jack the Ripper subject, I think I would like actually look into those aspects of it in the same way, is what the zeitgeist was, what was this feeling on the ground, what was the sudden shift. Now, I know there was 2 women murdered before the main 5, and they were basically straightforward murders, but they didn't make any sense either. And also, murders of women in the East End, other than crimes of passion, were very, very rare. Even though the place was like crime-ridden and everything, it was mostly punch-ups and drunkenness and this kind of thing. Murder was actually extremely rare, which tells you something too as well. Then there's the thing of the Freemasons protecting somebody, and that film with Johnny Depp and Christopher Lee, I forget what it was called, From Hell, because that was another thing. The mythology around the letters, the Dear Boss letter and the From Hell human kidney delivered. Nothing like this had ever happened before, added to the strangeness of it.
Yeah, if it was a group of high-ranking Freemasons, could it have been that somebody in a prestigious position had got one of the prostitutes pregnant, maybe, and some of the other girls knew about it, and they all had to be silenced?
But they wouldn't have done it like that. They would have. Now, we do know from the Spring Hill Jack story we covered that aristocratic types used to frighten women, working class women on the streets. When we went through that, so there's a possibility that could have been this kind of pranks on the working class women, but taken to this sick extreme level of killing them. And then we could indeed be dealing with someone who was in royalty, or someone who was very high up in the social standings of the British class system. So that's a possibility. And the one that always struck me was that the guy collecting the rent and saying that Mary Kelly was attacked, and what he witnessed, he never got over for the rest of his life. he was a changed man from what he experienced, what he saw of her body. And he only saw her through a broken glass pane. He didn't actually go into the room. And he said that it looked like a demon had torn her asunder. And yet it was in silence because there was neighbors all around. We heard nothing. So that's even like the kind of like brings to the phantom thing as well. You know, it's just so strange.
It was happening under the noses of everybody, wasn't it? It was the same as, because apparently the streets were as busy in the nighttime, if not busier, than they were in the daytime. So it would be a crowd. Imagine a crowded, busy street in the middle of a area of the city, and then women are getting their throats ripped and
no screams, and neighbors not hearing anything. There's one story of a guy walking through a backyard after he was going to work early in the morning, and he heard someone fall one of them against a fence. But where were the screams? Where were the struggles? It was like one minute these women were alive, and the next minute they had been butchered in split seconds by an unknown force. And the police autopsies do talk about an incision went here, an incision went there. But I often wondered, like, was it a knife or was it a claw? You know, you wonder these things, you know.
I read about, didn't one of them survive, one of the victims, and that prompted a double murder. He either got disturbed or something happened. He didn't finish the job on one of them, so he went off and he did another one further down the road. There was a night of, I think they called it the double murder.
He called it a double bill, and whoever wrote the Dear Boss letter says a double heading or a double header or something like that. He called it. Right. But yeah, so there's two answers to this, right? It was either a supernatural thing or a high-ranking aristocrat type who had protection from the police. But considering the contempt that the police had for the establishment over what was happening, they would have loved nothing more to drag the son of a duke or something like that up before the courts. So, you know, on every level, it makes no sense. Tell us about Blavatsky. I never heard about that one.
It came up with the Arthur Conan Doyle theory that she was also named as a suspect. That was all I could get, really. There was nothing more. It was just dropped in there with him talking about Jill the Ripper possibly being a midwife, and then her name came up as well. So I'd never come across that before either.
No, that's a new one for me too.
Couldn't find anything else about it.
1888 was the year that Alan Moore claims is the start of the modern world. The world that we live in today began in 1888. That was his kind of like his cultural year. I think Hitler was born that year. Van Gogh painted his first impressionist painting that year, his first neo-impressionist painting. And there was loads of other events in 1888 that defined the world that we live in today, including the Ripper murders and how they were covered by the media and so on. The sensationalism that didn't happen before that.
Well, look at everything sensationalized now, and every prolific high case serial killer that we've had, at least in the British press, has all been botched up by the police and the press as well. Look at the Yorkshire Ripper, what went on there with the Yorkshire West Yorkshire police.
They had him 3 times and let him go 3 times.
And that ridiculous voice, that recording that wasn't, well, we know who that was.
Yeah, Savile, the one they called Reside Pete, who I think he took the and also the fact that he used a single that only DJs could have, only cassette singles that were only issued to DJs, and the Andrew Gold single. And that's a whole other kettle of worms. But the murderers, Hindley and Brady, that has that supernaturalism about it. Especially, you know, when we had a Saturday morning seance, sent us the location report of the roaches and showed photographs, and that was like a kind of a pagan's spot. And there's, you know, Maura Hindley flashing her legs and trying to look like Dusty Springfield on the roaches. And that only added to that kind of supernaturalism. And you know that part of the world really well. And it's like, it's almost like the Brady and Hindley were an extension of the folklore in the area. What was the folklore of the East End before? You know, there's kind of like There's natural auguries, there's environmental auguries, but there's also folklore auguries as well.
Yeah, and makes you wonder, is that energy or that presence of whatever it was with the Ripper, as it travelled and moved, did it come up here in the 60s? Did it go up to Yorkshire in the 70s, 80s? Is it floating around? Is it just going around feeding under different identities, different people, moving from people?
Is it a politician? You know, you just don't know. Is it Savile? You know, you just don't know. But I think this is why that mystery prevails.
Just to lighten up a rather dark topic, do you remember Goodnight Sweetheart, the sitcom on TV in the 90s with Nicholas Lyndhurst? Right, well, it was a sitcom about a secret time traveller called Gary, and he was played by Nicholas Lyndhurst, and he had a time portal in his shop's backyard. So he lived a double life. He lived a life in the 90s and a life in the 1940s in the wartime. And in an episode, it was called The Houses in Between. Gary goes through the passage where this portal is. It's called Duckett's Passage, but he goes in the wrong way. So instead of going back to the 40s, he finds himself in the 1880s, and there's a serial killer there on the loose, and it's Jack the Ripper. So Gary manages to get back to his shop through the time portal, and he finds that Jack the Ripper's also a time traveller, and he's followed him through the portal. And he learns that the murderer has been actually using that portal in his back garden to as a hideout when he's committed the murders, and this is why he was never found or never seen. So due to the rules of time travel and Gary not being allowed to interfere with events in history, he reluctantly has to let Jack go. So Jack has it away on his toes, only to get run over and killed by a car on the street outside. And they say that's presumably why the Whitechapel murders ended when they did. Which it's you know, it was in a sitcom, just a bit of lightheartedness, because it's a dark topic, and sometimes you just need to lift it up a bit. Goodnight Sweetheart. Some people will have heard of that sitcom watching this, and they'll have probably seen it. So anyway, back to the seriousness. If you've got any theories about who or what you might think Jack the Ripper is, please put your theories in the comments, and we'll be very interested to read them.
Was he from Buckingham Palace? Was he from the Masons? Was he from hell? Okay, and now we go to the psychic hygiene with Sara. Are we going to be able to have a cleaner soul, or do we need a way to clean it? Are we grounded, or are we under the influence of something that's not good, not bad, and how do we deal with it? And here's Sara with the psychic hygiene.
Sometimes it can be difficult to set boundaries, but if you never say no, then you drain yourself emotionally and physically, and you end up filled with resentment towards a person or a situation. Most people don't like to say no because they're concerned what the other person will think of them if they do say no, and you can end up becoming all things to everyone with no time for yourself. So it's always a good idea to control how much time you spend around stressful people, the people who put you on edge or make you feel drained or miserable. Learn to say no sometimes and set clear limits and boundaries with people. You don't have to be available to everyone at all times. You don't have to be waiting on standby for people, and you don't have to be everybody's friend or personal entertainer. But there is a flip side to this, though, which is we often don't consider that while we may sometimes feel like this about other people, or other people feeling like that about us. So it's important to be mindful of ourselves too, and that we aren't being the one of those people who may be too demanding of other people's time. So remember, no is a complete sentence, and you can use it without justifying yourself when someone asks something of you that you don't want to do. And that's my psychic hygiene tip for this week.
sweet and straight to the point. And yeah, no is my favorite word. It served me very well in this life. And it's a form of tough love when you sort of like say, no, I'm not doing it. It's one thing to be a bastard and be a bit grumpy and a bit stroppy and, be difficult. I'm not like that normally. I'll just say no, and that's the end of that. If I don't want to do something, and I can tell you something that actually makes your life a hell of a lot better. Remember that thing from Finland? No, don't touch me there. This is my no-no square. Remember that?
Oh, I don't remember that.
Yeah.
Stop! Don't touch me there. This is my no-no square. Stop! Don't touch me there. This is my no-no square.
Stop! Don't touch me there. This is my no-no square. Keep your no-no square up here too as well.
Yeah. Well, so many people are embarrassed to say no because they think, I don't want to upset the other person, I don't want to offend them, and they end up doing things they don't want to do and then resenting the other person for it, when really you just say no, and 9 times out of 10 they just accept it and ask somebody else.
Yeah. I think we're told to be from the time we're kids to be people pleasers. Not me. To hell with that shit. No, not me. I'm the last person on earth who's like that. I've always done my own thing, and I'm honest and direct with people. I don't like say yes when I mean no. I just say no. And you're right. They don't get offended. They'd rather be straight with them.
Yeah, wouldn't you? If I said to you, if you said to me, do you want to come and do this, or do you want to go out? And I said, yes, and then I sit there with a miserable face on, like, because I don't want to be there. And it'd be better for me to say no, thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah, not only upsets you, but upsets everyone else as well. So you do them a favor, but you say, no, I'm not. There's a way. I'm diplomatic about it. I don't say no, get lost. I say, nah, it's not really my thing. That's not really what I'm into, and that's the way to do it. That's the kind of a diplomacy thing, nah, not really my thing. So don't go 9, go, nah, no, not really into it. Thanks anyway. There you go. And
it's less embarrassing. It's less embarrassing to say that than to say, sorry, I'm late. I didn't want to come.
Or I have a headache, or I had I didn't want, or yeah. No, really? No. Why not? I'm not really into it. Don't take it bad. That's not my thing. And they'll go, in 99% of the cases, they'll go, yeah, okay, fair enough, no problem. So no is not that hard.
No. And the more you say no, the easier it gets.
Yeah.
So long as you just don't say it for the sake of it, as long as it's something you don't want to do.
Remember, you're an adult and you're dealing with adults. So you don't have to deal with them like they're children. And deal with them the way you want to be dealt yourself. Straightforward, direct, and not like a kid. Okay, thank you for that, Sarah. And our third and final discussion topic tonight is the subject of poltergeists. Quite a popular and well-known, well-documented, well-mythologized, well-culturalized aspect of the paranormal and the Fortean. The term poltergeist comes from the Old High German Poltergeist, which means basically a disruptive spirit. Now, the poltergeist is generally associated with a malevolent spirit, an energy force that causes physical phenomena in the home or the business or where it's taking place. Objects flying around, noises, things being smashed, doors opening and closing. In the most extreme cases, throwing people around, levitation, physical assaults. Now, the poltergeist has been recorded back in the most ancient parts of history. There's been stories regarding it. There's 2 fields of looking at it. One is the parapsychological, natural phenomena aspect, in that somehow it's caused by some kind of sound vibration thing. There's even theories it has to do with vibrations of water in the ground or something that causes these things to move and fall around, not by themselves, but as a natural kind of effect. Then there's the more well-known paranormal aspect, where this is a spirit, a disruptive spirit, a ghost, or some kind of entity that's causing mayhem inside a family home. Now, generally, but not exclusively, it could be connected to teenage girls in fatherless homes going through or just about to go through puberty. There's been theories here that it's a kind of a need for a father figure expressed as what Jung called a catalytic exteriorization phenomenon, that a psychic blast of energy from the frustrated individual causes tables to crack, things to fly around, objects to be thrown at other people, doors to open and close violently, and so on. Now, the story of the teenage girls brings us to one of the most famous cases, and that being the Enfield poltergeist. Enfield is a suburb in London, and the story took place around two young girls. It's actually made to a few films and documentaries. And again, we have the story, poor family, no father, single mother, two young girls, one on the cusp of puberty, one just going through it. And the two girls experiencing this psychic phenomenon. It was the first one that the tabloid press took an interest in, and they worked with the paranormal investigators to record the thing. Now, people have said that the tabloid people make this all up and so on just to sell the papers. But if you look at the history of the Enfield poltergeist, the newspaper reporters were extremely sincere. They said that these things did happen. They were hit by Lego bricks that flew at them at high speed, and the girls didn't do it, and so on. And when that case basically ended, it was a combination of attacking the paranormal investigators for doing a terrible job, and also the tabloids for basically sensationalizing it. And then also the girls did it, and this is where it's so similar to the Cottingley fairies. The girls said that they did fake some of the things, but there was the poltergeist activity. And there was also a strange voice recorded on a tape recorder of an individual who lived in the house.
Right, that's good. I'm 72 years old. I come from Jewett Park graveyard, and I have right near the church where Rita lives. And all my friends come from there as well. And we all make a game and go to the pub. And then we pick your house, because I used to live here. And I will tell you some more. And if you don't get anyone else, just let Mr. and Mr. Playback.
I want you to tell me whether you remember what happened to you when you died. Just before you died and just after you died.
Days before I died, I went blind. Then I had an hemorrhage, and I fell asleep, and I died in a chair in the corner downstairs.
It's so interesting how it's similar to the Cottingley fairies, which you spoke about not too long ago. That the girls, yeah, it's real, but they also kind of had to fake it too to make people believe. And there are things that obviously look fake, like they're supposed to be levitating, they're clearly jumping up in the air in the photographs. But the people who experienced the whole thing as it was happening, although they've been trashed in the media and by the Society for Parapsychological Studies, maintain completely that was a poltergeist activity and it really happened, as did the two girls. So what do you think of poltergeist stories, Sarah?
Well, I've lived with one
I know you're going to.
for
I knew
4 years, so I can only come at it from my own experiences to say it was very real. But we were a happy family. There was me and my mum and my dad. I was 4, but we weren't the only flat in the block that was being affected by it. It did go to the flat underneath as well. And it did show up as there was apparitions as well as the ornaments being flown around and things moving around. We did see shadows, and it did travel to the flat underneath, and it would throw things in there as well.
So it's a possibility in a block of flats there was a girl there going through puberty, and that might have been the trigger for it.
I don't. There may have been. I don't remember if there was a girl that age who lived in the block of flats at all. I don't know, but I do know that in the flat that we lived in, we moved. It was 1976, and that before we took it on, a lady had died in the back room. So there had been a death in there. Whether that was anything to do with it, I don't know the circumstances of it. But you
were only a little girl, but did you see the actual things moving?
Yes.
Like, what was it like? Tell us about that.
Like, imagine, if you can imagine the difference between an ornament falling off the side of something and an ornament shooting across the surface of a shelf or a table and then coming off at high speed, like somebody's pushed it. So it doesn't just fall off, it actually flies across the table and then it'll fall off. Or if it was pushed off the fireplace, do you remember those old fireplaces that you had with the like not plastic, it was a resin, fake coals, and underneath you had the circles that went round to make it look like it was glowing, and then it had 2 bars, a 2-bar fire, and they were in the brick.
The false glow one, yeah.
Yeah, and then it was in the brick fire surround, and he had the brass ornaments on it and things. Well, they used to fly off. They didn't just fall off the edge; they come right at you. And the noise that it would make was like because it went that fast. And then you would get up in the morning, and the pictures would be upside down on the wall. What else?
Did you see the shadow people?
Yes, you could see it. We were on the top flat, and you could see it. It wasn't just walking; it was kind of creeping. Like hunched over, kind of creeping, and it would go all past the windows. I think my dad saw 2 ladies as well appear in the bedroom, and he said they were solid as anything. And they had Victorian dress on.
Was it an old building?
No, 1963. When the place was built, because it was part of the Manchester overspill. So it was.
Did your parents saw all the stuff too?
Yes, my dad was telling me that it was the first flat. They'd moved out of my grandparents' house because they were staying there, and they got the first place together, and they were really happy, and they'd been in there a few months. And one night my dad had said to me, "Mum, it's all right here, isn't it? It's nice." And then the following morning, when he got up, all the pictures were upside down.
Oh no.
So yes,
your dream home was about the fall kind of thing.
Yeah, so they put up with it for a while, and then they went and asked a couple of the other neighbours, and the other neighbours said no, nothing going on. And then they asked the neighbour downstairs, and she said yeah, but they'd been too embarrassed to say because they didn't know who to tell. So yeah, and it would shake my bed as well in the night, so the bed would shake and rattle, and it would mimic sweet papers, or crisp packets. When you're a kid and you hear a crisp packet or sweet wrappers, you think, oh, is that for me? What have you got in your pocket? And it would wake me up in the middle of the night, and it would rattle like what sounded like sweet wrappers or crisp packets. And I remember in particular one evening I'd woke up and I'd looked up, and I remember I had a brown glass light pendant on the ceiling. dark brown it was, and I was looking up at it in the darkness, and it actually turned into a horrible face.
You have a lot more experience with the ghosty end of things. Do you have any theories of what the thing might be, the actual poltergeist itself?
I do, but my theories on what they are don't really fit with what that was, because I think poltergeists do feed on energy, especially with people who argue and fight a lot in the house. And I think the more angry you are, the more they love it. But there was none of that going on. So unless there was going on in other flats, maybe that's possible.
Yeah, and it was like overspilled word again. It spilled over into your, your flats.
Yeah, it is possible. We left there in 1980, and so 4 years. 4 years we lived with that, and it didn't follow us. Well, I've not had any poltergeist activity like that since. And like I talked to you about it before, I knew the man who lived there through the 90s, and he said he hadn't had any goings on at the place, and he thought I was mad. But I remember it, and I used to have nightmares about having to move back there. I would dream that I had to move back there now as the age I am now, and I didn't want to do it, but I had to.
Wow.
Yeah, and even when I walk past it now, I
the
look at
building's
it.
still there.
Yeah, still there. I look at it and I feel like it's like looking back at me, maybe. But I don't know if that's the hauntology of it, the nostalgia of it, because there's so many ghosts there, so to speak, from your childhood. I don't know.
Psychic impression, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. So poltergeist activity is very real. Was it the poltergeist, or was it just a nasty
entity?
I don't know.
Of course, everybody thinks of that movie, that Steven Spielberg movie, Poltergeist from 1980, where you have this like perfect family, and the little girl is kind of pulled into another reality. I don't like that film. It hasn't aged well, like most of his films, with its like weird music and everything. But I think the clever thing was using the television as a kind of a portal. I did like that part of it, the coming through on the TV there here. But the film itself was like, I think, if you look at it now, it's ridiculous. It's absolutely, how it was ever a big hit. It's like a Disney does horror or something like that. It's really bad. But that's what most people think it is. But there is a film that was made, or it might have been a film or a mini series about the Enfield poltergeist a few years ago, and it was very, very. It might have been even on Netflix. It was very, very good, and it dealt with the parapsychologist investigator was kind of becoming a surrogate father for the two girls, because his own daughter, I believe, had died in his car crash, and it was very good how it played on that. That lost sibling, missing father dynamic, as if it was almost like this beautiful story of resolution with inside the story of the actual poltergeist. But that's a very good mini series if you can get your hands on that on it. But that's Poltergeist. If any of you have any experience with this stuff, or have like Sarah had it as a child and it didn't make sense why it was there, or anything, or heard stories or family members, let us know, because wow, I'm sure this must be one of the most common things. It seems to be quite commonly reported. So that's the poltergeist. Yep.
Especially in built-up areas.
Urban areas, yeah.
Urban areas, yeah.
Doesn't seem to happen in the country. Well, it's more stress in an urban area. People living on top of each other. But maybe, who knows? Maybe the poltergeist is even an urban fairy. That kind of it could be even dealing with something like that. But so I think that's what I'd.
Yeah, it could be a perpetual cycle where perhaps that energy causes high stress in certain people, and that feeds the poltergeist.
You mean like
the poltergeist creates
energy bonded to the location? Sorry, is that what you mean?
Yeah, it could be something that's happened there previously, and then it affects certain people who move there in a new building, perhaps. And that feeds the poltergeist, maybe. And then the poltergeist then creates more stress by the disruption that it causes. So the person becomes stressed again, and it's this self-perpetuating cycle that you can't break. So and many poltergeist cases, they disappear without any warning, just as easily as they appear sometimes, and nobody knows why or where they've gone.
I do like that theory that you have there, that it's a symbiotic thing, that the poltergeist force exists, waits for kind of like an activator, and the combination of both feed the experience. I really like that. I really like that theory a lot.
So that would, from that point of view, the only way to sort it out if you had one in your house would be to face it head on and not let it stress you, which is quite difficult when there's stuff flying all around. But that's the only way to break the cycle, is to play it at its own game, really, and ignore it. It's easier said than done.
Yeah.
Although, like you say, it's not Hollywood. It's not all Hollywood. I mean, we lived with one for 4 years, and it didn't do any of us any harm, apart from the fear factor,
right,
of not knowing what it was.
Oh, absolutely. And that'd be like your parents were probably like really worried for your sake, you know.
They used to play it down, just one of those things, or oh, it's nothing. But yeah.
Has that been your experience of poltergeists? Were you damaged by them? Let us know. And it's a strange one, but it's a very common one. Poltergeists. The small and independent country of the Isle of Man is nestled in the Irish Sea, surrounded, it is said, by the 5 kingdoms: England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and the Kingdom of Heaven. The island itself, along with its Manx population, retain a unique culture, with the northern half of the island being culturally Norse or Viking in origin, and the southern half of the island being Celtic and Gaelic in origin, with both halves of the islands having their own culturally appropriate folklore of elves in the north and fairies in the south. The Isle of Man is filled with all manner of paranormal events and location, which all sit within the Manx rich folklore tradition. However, without a doubt, the strangest Fortean tale to do with the Isle of Man surrounds that of Gef the Mongoose, when in September 1931, at a farmhouse in Cashin's Gap near the village of Dalby, a family named Irving, consisting of James, his wife Margaret, and their 13-year-old daughter Viore, claimed to have encountered a talking mongoose, which lived in their farmhouse walls. Following a series of strange scratching noises behind the wooden wall panels of the Irving's homestead, that a creature named Gef emerged and introduced itself, and then stated that he was a mongoose who was been born in New Delhi, India in 1852. Gef further proclaimed himself to be an extra clever mongoose, and to this added, "I am a freak, I have hands and I have feet, and if you saw me you'd faint, you'd be petrified, mummified, turned into a pillar of salt." Gef the Talking Mongoose also claimed, intriguingly it has to be said, to be an earthbound spirit, a ghost in the form of a mongoose. In 1935, magazine editor Richard S. Lambert, along with paranormal investigator Harry Price, went to Dalby to investigate the case, and their findings leaned on the side of objective neutrality. After taking some castings of Gef's alleged paw prints, Harry Price sent them to the Natural History Museum in London, whereby they could not be matched to any known species of mammal, not even those of a mongoose. Gef the Talking Mongoose became something of a domestic spirit who guarded the Irving farmhouse and performed all manner of chores and useful acts around the home. Gef allegedly enjoyed a diet of chocolate and bananas, which he only ate when he thought no one was watching. Remarkably, other residents of the village of Dalby, as well as visitors, claimed to have heard Gef speaking, although physical traces of Gef's existence were hard to come by. After the Irvings had sold their farmhouse in 1946 to a Leslie Graham, who then claimed he had shot and killed Gef the talking mongoose, although this was generally believed to have been a different animal shot by Graham. There were some psychic investigators who thought Gef might have been a poltergeist and somehow connected to aspects of James Irving's subconscious personality, while some residents of the Isle of Man, and it is worth bearing in mind that this may have been rooted in jealousy as much as skepticism, believed the Irving family had invented Gef the talking mongoose story as a hoax. Some have even suspected Viore made the Gef noises, perhaps initially as some form of imaginary friend using ventriloquism. However, the girl and her family constantly rejected this. The last major investigation of Gef the talking mongoose was by Nandor Fodor, a research officer for the International Institute of Psychical Research. While Nandor Fodor was unable to find any hard proof for the existence of Gef, he also made a point of not confirming that the talking mongoose didn't exist. Arriving in Dalby, initially suspecting that Gef was most likely a poltergeist, Fodor eventually decided that he could not reach any definite conclusion as to what the nature of the spook of Dalby, to use another local name for Gef, actually was. In 1970, Fate magazine conducted an interview with Viore Irving. Although reluctant to discuss the Gef manifestation from her early teens, she nonetheless insisted that Gef the talking mongoose had indeed existed. This is Thomas Sheridan reporting for Hocus Focus from the Isle of Man.
Now it's time to find out if the atmospheric pressure will be heavy or light this week. There's no such thing as bad weather, only the wrong clothing. So get your Renfield rain max and your welly bobs at the ready, just in case. It's time for Thomas with the psychic weather.
Well, it is rainy. The psychic weather this week is frustration through stagnation. It's not just me. Everyone I meet is just feeling very grumpy at the moment. There's a sense of this very long winter in this part of the world has not ended yet and doesn't seem to want to go away. It seems like it's been 100 years since last November. There's that feeling. There's people are grumpy, people are antsy, fed up, uninspired. Now, that's usually a sign that energy is not flowing. So there's some kind of psychic energy in the zeitgeist is not flowing. And so it's just not moving. When it's not moving, you get this sense of grumpiness, this sense of stagnation, this sense of meh, kind of like this kind of stagnation. And that's where we are at the moment. The good news is the energy will start flowing again. But that's where we are absolutely right now. We're in Grumpysville, population me and everyone else, and that's the psychic weather.
Yeah, can relate to that. I've been the same. Just fed up. Nothing going right. It's like flat in fog or trying to get through fog just to get from A to B.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And when you try to be creative to get away from it, even that doesn't work out right.
No. Oh, there's a spanner in the works everywhere you look. So, yeah, I've been a bit of a grumpy git this week.
Me too. And it seems everyone else has been as well. We just have to wait for it to pass. And you're probably tired of me saying it by now, but this is my favorite part of the show. And it allows me to be like a little kid with show and tell at school. And Sara as well, be sure the books that inspired us on our 40 and paranormal journeys. And lots of you have been getting these books based on the recommendations here. And that's great to hear, because that's sharing this knowledge, I believe, is very important to us. I know Sara feels the same way too. My book this week is about a subject we have covered as a story on the show, and that is our old friend, the Mothman. And this book is called The Facts Behind the Legend by Donnie Sargent Jr. and Jeff Wamsley. Now, what I like about this book is it has the basic story of the Mothman thing from when it happened in Point Pleasant in West Virginia, from the initial apparitions in the TNT area outside the city, outside the town. But what's great about this is it's a scrapbook mostly, and it has all the newspaper cuttings from the era, from all the local newspapers concerning the Mothman. It's got eyewitness reports, the actual typed up police reports, and it's an exercise in how to do Fortean research. Clippings, how they used to do it in the old days, store up the clippings. And the book is a treat just for that. So you get your Mothman story in the beginning, then you get the eyewitness handwritten and typed, the police typed up accounts. But it goes one step further. It covers an aspect of the phenomena and of the Mothman experience in Point Pleasant that's generally left out of the story, and I don't know why. And that is the UFO sightings before and after the Mothman sightings. The two things are intrinsically related. The UFO sightings up and down the Ohio Valley, along with the Mothman. Now, it also has clippings of people saying the Mothman is a big owl or a crane or some other kind of bird. But when you read the chronology of the clippings, you start to see the media going less from like ridiculing it, more to like there's something very odd going on here. And then back to kind of like, oh, it's an animal, you know, that kind of thing. So you can see it like took the authorities into like the dark side as well. And John Keel in his book, The Mothman Prophecies, covered the UFO stuff. And not the one that was made into the film, not that version of the book, the original 1960s version of the book that he did. And this book is a Fortean delight. You have all the information on the story, and it's just great fun going through all these old newspaper clippings from the Ohio Valley, from that part of West Virginia and Ohio across the river, regarding all these phenomena that happened in the time. And it really makes you really understand what that place was an enormous hotspot of Fortean activity. So that's my one this week. Mothman, The Facts Behind the Legend, Donnie Sargent Jr. and Jeff Walmsley. And it's A4 size, which is great too. I'm starting to like A4 books better for some reason. Don't know. They're good for the toilet, I think. We know Sara and I often talk about that. What makes a book great is that it's good for when you're sitting on the jacks. So the Mothman Prophecy, Mothman, The Facts Behind the Legend.
I like that. Clippings. I love clippings because we used to do it at school. We used to be allowed to do a project at primary school, and we'd done our maths and English and whatnot. We could get our projects, and that basically was a scrapbook that we could fill with clippings of any subject that we wanted.
Well, that is scrap, but the Mothman and the UFO sightings.
Yeah, I mean, I might have to start doing that again for this show, because when we do research for this show, if I've got a book about the topic we're doing, I always love to read it from the book rather than go scouring online. Something special about clippings and books and things like that.
There's nothing online anymore other than Wikipedia. All the other 14 websites are gone.
Yeah, like back in the 90s, they were everywhere, weren't they?
Yeah, or they're clickbait rubbish, you know, full of ads.
But yeah, I like that. that's a nice coffee table book and a nice take to the toilet book, as you say, and just pick it up and,
Yeah.
pass a few minutes. Okay, my book this week is The Healing Energies of Water by Charlie Ryrie. I don't know if you can see that there. And it shows the many ways in which water can be used to heal and maintain health. And it also talks about the vibrational nature of water. And it has lots of suggestions for drinking water for optimum health and various ailments. And it goes into the bathing ritual as well. And the Hindus believe that water has a soul. So bathing is a spiritual ceremony and a way of restoring harmony to the body and the mind and the spirit, as well as connecting with the divine realms. And it has recipes for different baths for calming and cleansing, as well as baths to relieve various ailments and aches and pains. And an interesting tidbit from the book is, that weed that you find in the garden, the one that takes over horsetail or mare's tail, as it's sometimes called, and it's as old as the dinosaurs and it's very prolific. Well, it was used in healing practices by the ancient Greeks because it's a astringent and a diuretic and a good tissue healer. And it contains some of the most valuable minerals that the body needs, like silica and potassium and manganese and magnesium. And you can use this weed to mineralize your water for bathing, which aids the immune system. And the book is just jam-packed full of this sort of stuff, information about the various ways you can use water for optimum health and well-being, and it's highly recommended.
Who wrote it again?
He's called Charlie Ryrie. It's a funny name, Ryrie, Ryrie. And there's lots of colourful pictures in there as well, ancient Greeks and ancient Egyptians. It goes right back to the ancient times.
Ritual bathing and all that stuff. Yeah, very good. So it's an attractive looking book too.
Yeah, it's very old as well. It was given to me by a dear friend. He's passed away now, but in 1988. And it's a bit of a treasure. It's a special one.
So that's another Hocus Focus, number 15, wrapped up. Thanks everybody for tuning in and sharing the show around, and keep sharing it and keep commenting, keep liking, and keep publicizing it, because we really do feel we have something special here. And so before we get to the tarot card, I will say goodbye, good night, and let Sarah say good night.
Yeah, thank you for watching. It's been great having you with us again this week. We hope you enjoyed the show. And as Thomas said, please keep liking and sharing and continue the conversation in the comments section. The comment section's there for you.
Okay, now it's time for the tarot card. What have you got for us this week, Sarah?
Tarot of the week this week is the Four of Pentacles. And the Four of Pentacles shows a wealthy man who's balancing a coin on top of his head, which is preventing his connection with the divine. And his arms grip his money close to his chest, and he's symbolizing his fear that he might lose control because he's got his arms wrapped tightly around his financial nest. He also has both feet firmly flattened on the floor, covering the coins, and sitting highly above a vast city. He's stuck there. He's not able to go anywhere for fear of dropping or losing a coin. And the coins literally have him stuck in his seat, and he appears isolated, only concerned with the financial aspects of life. And the black shawl that envelopes him like a cloud represents the control that this money has over him. And the smug look on his face seems to be one of pride and satisfaction. Now, the card could be a warning against being too materialistic, to have been so focused on the success of something that you might have isolated yourself from those who care about you. And the card's a reminder that you can feel secure in life without having to be thinking about the pennies all the time. Find some balance and don't sacrifice important things for financial gain. The card could also indicate there may be an attitude of scarcity, which causes hoarding instead of spending. Money may be being hoarded instead of using it for living a nice, balanced life. And if you're saving, then maybe your savings plan is so strict that it takes away the pleasures of life. And the card can indicate that you may be holding on to something so tightly that it won't go away. Maybe there's something that you need to let go of. Are you clinging on to people or possessions in order to make you feel safe to the point of it being unhealthy for you? Some view the upright position as a warning to save, while others see it as a chastisement against greed. Keep it as a reminder not to be too focused on money and possessions. Your worth is not determined by the type of car you drive or how big your house is. Wealth is different from riches. Being wealthy means you live a balanced life with people who value you for who you are and not what you have or what you do.
Number 4, very significant number. The 4 seasons, the 4 cardinal points, the 4 books of the Quran, the 4 books of the Gospels, the 4 stages of man, and so on. And also in terms of the male archetype in this card, it represents a man who's difficult to know. Is that he hides, like he said, like it's like he represents a kind of a dark horse type, not in a negative way, but it's like you can never fully understand what he's thinking inside and what really going on in there. So a lot of women who are trying to get to know a man in that way will often draw that card to tell them that he's not shy, not withdrawn, not even guarded. He just likes to keep himself inside himself. And it's not necessarily a bad thing either. It's just that that's the way he is. He's got 4 secrets inside him, and he prefers to keep it that way. Not dark secrets or anything. He likes his sense of privacy. So it's a good card, that. It's actually a card that tells you a lot. So thanks for that, Sarah. Good night, everybody, and we'll see you for episode 16 on Sarah's channel, Sara Mondaini. Bye-bye.
Good night.